This video classroom lesson is sponsored by Transmission Bench. Visit the transmissionbench.com store for the deluxe super kit, other parts, and even the video classroom lessons used during this project.
My favorite part of a Ford transmission lesson is the opening. It's when I get to share one of Henry Ford's famous sayings with you, like this one. If everyone is moving together, then success will take care of itself. He also said, coming together is a beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. We're about to begin working together in order to successfully rebuild a like-new automatic transmission. It's great to have you back. This is Ford E4OD 4R100 class, Lesson 2. Let's move forward and make some progress. But before we actually begin work, let me introduce you to the star of the show. It's a great-looking, very clean 4R100, which came from a two-wheel drive 2000 Ford Expedition powered by a 5.4-liter engine. It's not only clean on the outside, but also on the inside too. I've already taken it apart, scrubbed the dirt and grease from the outside, and reassembled it without any fluid on the inside. This version of the E4OD 4R100 transmission is a typical model for demonstration, but not necessarily exactly like the model you may be working with. There are variations not only with earlier and later versions, but also between gas and diesel versions too. There are actually 15 different cases that I'm aware of. The bell housings, for instance, have 4 different bowl hole configurations. There is a high-top big block version which fits the 460 cubic inch gas engine, a 302 and 351 cubic inch small block case which has 2 starter bolt holes, a 5.4, 5.8, and 6.8 liter gas engine version which takes 3 starter bolts, and finally another unique configuration for the diesel engines. Our demo, by the way, is the 5.4, 5.8, and 6.8 liter type with 3 starter bolt holes. I'll discuss as many of the internal variations as I can during the lessons. Our goals for this lesson are to begin the disassembly with the removal of external parts and the components accessible after removing the bottom pan. One more thing before we get started. Locate a pair of your very best friends during this project, safety glasses, and put them on now. Let's get to work. As I mentioned in Lesson 1, the transmission should be on a suitable, sturdy work surface. It should also be drained of as much fluid as possible. This demo unit has been cleaned up for clarity, but your transmission should still be filthy dirty. Remember, the bare case, extension housing, and pan can be cleaned with water and detergent later after complete disassembly. Remove the torque converter by pulling it straight out. Set it aside. If the version you are working on has a vent hose, remove it and save it to reinstall later. Set it onto the parts bench where it can remain undisturbed during the project. 1998 and later models may have a turbine shaft speed sensor or a block-off plug in this location. Our demo model was not equipped with the sensor and has the plastic plug. If the transmission you are working on has either one, Use an 8mm socket and ratchet to remove the bolt which fastens it to the case. Twist and pull the sensor out or pry the plug out with a screwdriver. Place the plug and bolt or the turbine shaft speed sensor, bracket, and bolt into one of the small parts boxes. This is the MLPS, or Manual Lever Position Sensor. Use an 8mm socket and ratchet to remove the two bolts which fasten it to the case. Pull the sensor off of the manual lever. Place the sensor onto the bench. Put the bolts into a box. Removal of the extension housing is next. 9 bolts attach it to the case. If you are working with a 4-wheel drive version, removal of the adapter housing, except for longer bolts, is the same. If any of the bolts have threaded studs for attaching a wiring harness, make a mark on the housing to remind you of where they go later. I simply use a pick and scribe an X next to it. The 2 bolts located here are 1/4 of an inch shorter than the others. I'll remind you of where they go later during reassembly. Use a 13mm 1/2-inch drive socket, extension, and ratchet to remove them. Place the bolts into a box. Remove the extension housing. There is a gasket between it and the case. Peel it off or wear gloves and use a scraper to remove it. Set them down in this area of the parts bench. 1997 and later models have a cooler bypass tube assembly on the passenger side of the case, which should be removed now. Use a 6-point half-inch drive 7/8 inch socket and ratchet to remove the hollow bolts which fasten it to the case. Look closely at the cooling passage bolt holes. Some models have O-rings installed into a recess just before the threads begin. If you find one, remove it and place it onto the threads of the hollow bolt to remind you to replace it later. Keep the tube, bolts, and sealing washers together as an assembly and take it to the parts bench. Place it in this area. I've repositioned the transmission upside down in order to remove the bottom pan and work in the valve body area beneath it. Wooden blocks are used to level the case. This is the converter drain access cover. If you haven't already done so, remove it by pushing it out. Set it with the other small parts. Use a 10mm socket, extension, and ratchet to remove the 20 pan bolts. I'll set them down together on this end of the box. Lift the pan up and off of the case. Turning it over, you should find a magnet in the middle area. It will probably have, at the very least, a pudding-like black sediment on it. For now, don't attempt to clean it. Take it to the other bench and place it here like so. You can use scrap wood to keep it level. If the gasket remained with the case, remove it now. You may find an earlier cork type or, as you see here, the later reusable molded rubber type. Set it onto the pan rail. Even if the gasket is the earlier disposable cork type, save it and set it here anyway. It's a good habit to save everything, including parts made from paper and cork, as well as the other parts which are normally thrown away. You may need to compare it with a new part later. Again, save everything. Remove the filter by twisting it side to side while pulling it upward. If the rib seal remained in the pump intake bore, pry it out with a medium screwdriver and place it onto the filter tube. This is the 4-wheel drive type filter because of the 1 3/4 inch long intake pipe. The 2-wheel type used with the shallower pan has only a 1/2 inch long pipe. Set it into the pan like so. This is how it is normally positioned when installed. In order to help you become familiar with and more comfortable working in the valve body area, I'll spend a few minutes to discuss the three main sections. I'll begin with this rectangular aluminum casting just behind the bell housing. It's called the accumulator valve body. There are 4 spool valves and calibrated spring assemblies within it, which determine how firmly the transmission shifts. We'll heavily modify this section later. This is the main valve body. It contains, first of all, the manual valve, which is the valve you directly control as you move the selector lever on the steering column. It also houses the 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4 shift valves. There are also other valves, some of which regulate timing and transition between shifts. This smaller rectangular section is the solenoid body, or as it is sometimes called, the solenoid pack. It is made up of a single aluminum casting with 4 electronic shift solenoids, a pressure control solenoid, and a temperature sensor. This is a non-serviceable part which is simply replaced during a rebuild. The 3 sections, along with this stiffener plate, are fastened to the case with 28 8mm hex-headed bolts, circled in red, 9 T-30 Torx bit type bolts, denoted in blue, and 5 nuts on the end of studs, circled in black. Sandwiched between all of these structures and the case is a large steel separator plate along with gaskets on both sides of it. Note these 2 bolts are not circled. They are used to fasten this additional casting to the main valve body and do not go all of the way through the castings and into the case. Let's begin removal of the accumulator valve body by using a 10mm socket to loosen and remove the 2 nuts from the locating studs here and here. Place the nuts into a box. Use an 8mm socket to remove 11 bolts circled in red. Note all of the bolts are 1 7/8 of an inch long. Keep them together as a group and set them into yet another box. You can now slowly and carefully lift the casting. Try to avoid tearing the gasket beneath it. If it does tear, it's okay. New gaskets come in the rebuilding kit. Turn it over. And set it like this into the pan over the filter. Removal of the solenoid body is next. Remove a 10mm headed nut. Finish unbolting the casting by unscrewing the 9 Torx headed bolts with a T-30 bit and ratchet. Set these unique bolts here across from the 8mm headed ones. Detach the casting by rocking it side to side with your left hand as you push up on the case connector with your right. Try not to tear the gasket. Place it into the pan in this area. The last large section to remove is the main valve body. First, back out these 2 nuts. You should now have a group of 5 nuts in this box. There are now 14 bolts left fastening the casting to the case. Note the bolts which go through the main and additional castings are 2 7/8 inches, or exactly 1 inch longer than the other shorter ones. Back all of them out and leave the 2 uncircled bolts alone. Remember, these 2 bolts fasten the 2 castings together and do not protrude all the way into the case. Take the 7 shorter 1 7/8 inch long bolts and place them with the other 1 7/8 inch bolts. Now get the remaining longer 2 7/8 inch long bolts. Set these longer bolts into this box together as another separate group. Lift the main valve body up and off of the separator plate. Turn it over. Set it like so with the other castings into the pan. Let's pause and take a break. I want to limit the lessons to a reasonable length, and I think we've made enough progress for this session. When you're ready to continue, meet me in lesson 3 and we'll finish up the valve body area disassembly.